Said, today is Wednesday, the 7th of September, and I'm speaking with Mr. Gayther Plummer. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Mr. Plummer?
Yeah.
Mr. Plummer, can you tell me some of your experiences during the era of World War II? Can you tell me anything of where you were between 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago?
Well, at the outset of the war, I was a student in high school, and I heard about it in chemistry class one Monday morning, as I recall. I was in the class of 43, and we were 1 year after the induction of the largest portion of the World War II crowd. So I went into service in July of 1943 in Fort Campbell and was immediately sent to Biloxi, Mississippi as part of the United States Army Air Force in those days. And I had basic training at Biloxi, Mississippi, and then I was shipped to the University of Tennessee for what we called Cadet Training Detachment, CTD, and I was at the University of Tennessee for 3 months before actually being classified as a cadet and moving into the training. There were a lot of us in the cadet training program at that time. But the training period was routine, ordinary, nothing exciting about that. The most exciting part for me began, of course, on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. And at that time, I was a student pilot in a primary flying school at Ocala, Florida. And in those days, Ocala was small, gorgeous, and centered around Silver Springs. The flying school was a private flying school, and we were flying ancient aircraft just to learn. The weather in the 1940s was generally wet, and we were hampered every day, particularly in Florida, by, if not fog in the morning, rain showers in the afternoon. So the primary flying school was fascinating in many ways, some of which we had more insects buzzing around us than we cared about, the gnats, and the weather was always a problem around which we had to navigate. But when D-Day occurred, it was raining that day, and we were kept on the ground most of the morning. There were 4 students and 1 instructor, and we sat around theorizing what was happening in Europe at that time. That lasted just about all day. On August the 6th, 1944, I arrived at Cochran Field near Macon about 1 o'clock in the morning for my second phase of pilot training, and that was known then as the Basic Flying School. Now, back in those days, rumors were rampant, and we had heard down in Ocala that anybody went to Macon was issued a .45 sidearm, because if he ever got down in the swamp, he was going to have to shoot his way out with alligators, which really wasn't the fact at all. But with a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds, why, those kind of stories make for a great deal of excitement, and that's the way it was. So we came to Macon in anticipation of beginning a basic flying school, but we knew we were in an advanced training mode. We were told that we were being trained for Pacific theater activities. I remember this was in '44, before the atomic era, in Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, and those battles were fresh. So I was in an experimental group in which we were given advanced aircraft in basic flying conditions. And we were excited about that. We were very excited. So for the next 3 months, until roughly Thanksgiving, between early August and Thanksgiving, we were flying advanced aircraft in basic flying school at Cochrane Field. And to me, that was a very formidable period in my life, because it not only set the pattern that I had in flying, but it also set my career as climatology and ecology. Well, as I said, the weather in '44 was wet, and we had 3 aircraft accidents commencing about the middle of September, early October, and then mid-October. And all 3 of these accidents were weather-related, flying around clouds, aerobatics in these super fast aircraft. To us, they were super fast. And the captain of my squadron, whose name was Benson, Captain B.E.W. Benson, he was a pilot in the Africa theater. He flew P-41s, as I recall. Well, anyhow, he admonished all of us because of the 3 accidents, and he told us very emphatically that we must check with the Weather Bureau every time we flew, because the Weather Bureau was 75% accurate most of the time. And that 75% accuracy has stayed with me all these years, and I think was to some extent the basis of my interest later on in climate and weather. Well, about this time, about the second week in September, we cadets at Macon went on a bivouac one weekend. And we all climbed in the back end of trucks. They drove us out in the countryside around Macon and dumped us off. We had to walk 4 miles and stay overnight. That was my first camping experience, and it was rough. We camped near a watermelon patch, and watermelons in September are generally beyond growth, but we cut open 14 watermelons, according to the little diary that I kept at that time. And not a one of the watermelons was good, much to our chagrin. But the flying experiences at Macon were marvelous. All of us enjoyed it. We enjoyed Macon at that time, although Macon was bleak in those days.
Was the field south of the
Yeah.
downtown area?
Yes, it was south. And since I have been in Georgia, now I've been back there many, many times. And until about 5 years ago, the weather facilities at Macon were exactly at the same spot they were when I was there in 1944. As a matter of fact, the municipal building today is on the very spot that my squadron occupied back in 1944. And to some extent, the area looks similar today as it did then. But of course, things always change. But from Macon, I moved to Valdosta on Thanksgiving Day, 1944, and to Moody Field. And there again, we were given bombers instead of advanced trainers for our experimental program. And when I walked to the flight line and saw these Billy Mitchell B-25 bombers as the airplanes we were going to fly, we were amazed, not only at their size, but at their sheer beauty at that time. So from Thanksgiving Day 1944 through January of 1945, Moody Field was my base of operation while I was learning to fly these B-25s advanced. An interesting aspect of that, Moody Field also was a prisoner of war camp for German POWs who had fought in Rommel's Africa Corps. And there may have been some German prisoners at Moody Field also from the European invasion. We never really knew, but we knew that the Africa Corps boys were there. And many of us were impressed by their blonde hair, their straight hair, and their stiff attitude. Now, the German POWs then were assigned menial duties in the camp. They kept our hot water heaters going. The water in those days was heated with gas burners, and they tended our latrines and our showers.
Again, this is the of two tapes featuring Mr. Gayther Plummer on the 7th of September. And before I interrupted, Mr. Plummer was telling me about the prisoners from Germany on Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta, Georgia.
You want me to go back and...
By all means. Continue, please.
Well, one of the fascinating aspects of life at Moody Field was the German prisoners of war that were encamped on a corner of the Air Force Base. I don't know how many were there, I don't remember, but they did housekeeping jobs, tending our barracks and cleaning the latrines and keeping the water heaters going, and to some extent taking the chill off of the barracks that occurred during January. We were impressed with the blonde young men, straight hair, their demeanor, their straightness, their pomp, their circumstance. We were not allowed to talk with them. We were told over and over again, you don't communicate with them, but when they're in your area every day, you learn to wave at them, you acknowledge them, you say thank you for things they did and that sort of thing, and they were always eager to communicate with us, but we were warned over and over again not to communicate with them. Nevertheless, some of them worked in our mess hall and prepared our food. Thanksgiving dinner in 1944 was prepared by the German chefs, and it was delicious. It was the best dinner that I'd had in service anywhere. And our breakfasts were always prepared by the German POW who were assigned to cooking duties. Another fascinating thing, as I recall, is the lights all shine 24 hours a day on the POW encampment, which was off of the corner. And because it shined all night long, and because they worked sometimes 24 hours a day doing various things for the Army, there was always a contingent of them playing soccer. And no matter what time of the night we'd wake up or come in or something like that, we could always hear a cheering section in the German POW camp for the soccer games. And of course that was their form of exercise. Well, on the 31st of January 1945, when I was 19 years old, I had just been commissioned second lieutenant and was now ready to move on to the Pacific Theater. There were about 225 of us who graduated at Moody Field on that graduating class. About half were second lieutenants, and the other half were flight officers. I don't know what the difference between the two or how it was determined, but nevertheless we did have those two echelons. Now by this time it was increasingly clear that the war was moving very rapidly, and there was beginning to accumulate a backlog of pilots waiting to go into training. So we got extended leaves. I got a 21-day leave, which was unusual. And after that leave period, I was sent to Lincoln, Nebraska, where we were in training, or beginning our training for B-29 pilot instruction. I'd also had some B-24s. I had been in Cortland, Alabama, and had been flying B-24s, so I had B-25s and B-24s, and was now on my way to B-29 school. And while I was awaiting to go to B-29 school, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, and we sort of waited out the remainder of the time until I was discharged late in November, actually in early December of 1945. So that was briefly my military career, but my military career in Georgia was fascinating. To me, it was a tremendous experience. It was an introduction to the South, which I had never known about, but I got to see Georgia from above, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Where do we go from here?
Well, how old were you in 1945?
Well, I became 19 on January the 27th of 1945. No, I didn't. I became 20 at that time. So the commission was my birthday present, I guess, on the 20th birthday. Of course, all of us were young, 19, 20 years old at that time. I wasn't unusually young for that sort of thing.
Where had you grown up?
I had grown up in Indiana, on a farm in the summertime and in the city in the wintertime. But during my high school period, this was at the early part of the war period when the war was commencing, and the pot was brewing, the festering of international relations and so on. And at that time I had even thought about going into meteorology. I'd applied to go to meteorology school, but changed, and I decided to enlist in the Air Force instead, so I got my meteorology, climatology in the Air Force.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes,
can you
I
tell
had
me
one.
about the rest of your family?
Well, my brother, I had one brother, younger brother, and a younger sister. My younger brother got in the war also after I did. My younger sister was through high school all during that period. And of course, I don't know what happened back home. My father was a railroad man. And being a railroad man in those days was like working for the airlines today. It was fashionable, somewhat prestigious, and it was a job that a lot of young men aspired to. But as I recall, the railroad work it was difficult, laborious, no different than what some of the airline work is today.
What was the closest town to the farm you grew up on in Indiana?
Well, I actually was born in Indianapolis. My mother's came from a farm family, and they lived down near Cincinnati. Their area was Franklin County, and in those days a person could make a living about 150 to 250 acres of farmland. Now this was the late 20s and the early 30s, of course. So my mother's family were relatively small, self-sustaining farmers. And that too was a very formidable period in my life because I got a chance to work with horses, to operate, participate in the operation of thrashing rings, worked on the thrashing machine, and of course the reapers. And being a part of farm life in those days was a very educational experience.
Can you recall for me December, was it 7th of 1941? Do you recall hearing about Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes, yes. As I mentioned earlier, I was in high school, and it happened in Pearl Harbor, of course, in the morning, which to us was a different time of the day. But on Monday morning, when I got to high school, everyone was excited, and my first class in the morning was a chemistry class. And we had a little portable radio. It wasn't portable, but it was a small radio that sat on the chalk ledge of our chemistry class, and the whole class sat there in astonishment and anxious to hear what was going on, because we had already heard that war was about to be declared. But for me, it was chemistry on Monday morning.
What did you all think of, at the time, of President Roosevelt?
Well, of course, it was always there was excitement. But youngsters, 17, 18 years old, anything different is new and exciting. And we were anxious, not knowing what it really meant. My father was in World War I, and he discussed the war with me and my family on a number of occasions, and we had some understanding and some apprehension about what was going on. But to a teenager, Monday morning, December the 8th, was just another day with exciting news, not knowing what was ahead. Yet, we did understand it in a way. One of my friends had already been to Africa and had an arm shot off and had come back home. So I had some general idea of what it was about, but it was just another exciting day.
Germans or Italians shot his arm?
I don't know how it happened. I don't recall. I know that he enlisted early. He went off and came back wounded, and again we were astonished because he was young and he was a part of us. So there were a few of us who had some feeling about what was ahead.
Have you flown since your time in the service?
I flew for a while. After the war, I enlisted in the Air Force Reserve, but I also went on to college. And during the time I was in college, it was impossible for me to keep up my commitments to the Air Force Reserve. So after about 7 or 8 years in the reserve, I just dropped out and quit. And that was after the Korean War. I flew off and on until about 1953 or 54, somewhere along in there. Then I gave up my license and started on my professional activities.
Would you tell me some about the rest of your career? You mentioned that you studied climatology and ecology, and I maybe missed. Why don't you set me straight?
Well, after the war, I went to Butler University and got a degree in botany. I also worked for the Indiana Department of Conservation, and I was a naturalist at state parks, at several state parks in Indiana, one of which was called Turkey Run. Marvelous place, outdoor. My wife and I were married in 1950, and we spent our 3 months honeymoon working in another state park in Indiana. And we worked in the state park the following summer also. But as a student, I was interested in plant sciences. And I went on to Kansas State and got a master's degree in plant pathology. And then went on to Purdue and got a doctorate in biology, but my major was actually in a combination of civil engineering and forestry and agriculture because I was interested in ecology. And I used all of my flying experiences to pursue a study in aerial photography on color imagery of certain kinds of plants and the plants of southern Indiana. In the meantime, I'd also taken a year off and taught at Knox College, and then I taught at Antioch College 1 year before I came to the University of Georgia in 1955. And I came to the university to teach plant ecology, a time when ecology was in its infancy. So for the next 39 years, I taught plant sciences, climate and weather, and just recently I relinquished my tenured position after 46 and a half years. But the Air Force taught me climate and weather, and climate and weather was a part of my life during the droughty 30s and the droughty 50s. So in 1978, Governor George Busby appointed me climatologist for the state of Georgia in conjunction with a program operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So for the past 16 years or so, I've been doing exclusively climate work on behalf of Georgia.
That's a great deal of stuff. Can you describe for me some more of the conditions? You've described conditions of drought in the 30s and 50s.
Yes.
Were there unusual weather conditions you had to deal with in the 1940s on those bases? Or?
Well, farmers are always anxious when the soil gets dry. And during the 1930s and the late 20s, droughts had plagued the farmers of Indiana. And when I was on the farm in the summers of 1931, 32, and 33, we had dry weather. Not only did we have dry weather, but we also had rusty wheat. Now, rusty wheat and dry weather oftentimes don't go together because rust must have wet grounds to infect the wheat systemically. Nevertheless, we had wet springs and we had dry summers. And I remember I was just a chap and I had to ride one of the horses in order to keep the horses in line on the reaper. And the white horse became so red with the rust spores that I was amazed at how similar he looked to the bay horse on my side. And furthermore, the wheat was so rusty then that the platform canvas on the reaper was just orange red, as if somebody had just allowed rust to take over. Well, those droughts are impressive because we had normally been getting 30, 35 bushels of wheat to the acre, and our yield was down to 9 or 10 bushels. And when your cash crop depends on money, that kind of a drop, that filters down to children, because that means that children don't get new straw hats, and we didn't get new overalls, and we're going to have to make the shoes last a little longer. So to that extent, droughts do impress upon youngsters, and it impressed upon me. And of course, when 36 came around, I was then 10, 12 years old, and during the drought 36 and the Dust Bowl, and I was experienced with the Dust Bowl. I knew about it, but not, of course, until I got into college and read about the impact of the Dust Bowl did I understand what droughts really meant nationwide. The Dust Bowl impressed upon me as far as the farm was concerned, but the Dust Bowl did not impress upon me until I was in college and had a broader view of the overall situation. So to that extent, droughts and weather made an impression on 10, 12-year-old kid as well as a 5 or a 6-year-old kid.
And atmospheric conditions when you were flying, can you detail for me some of the instruments or some of what you learned about?
Well, that commenced at Cochrane Field, and in the September, October at Macon, I distinctly remember the tall cumulus clouds, and they were fun to fly around and play with. And in the morning, when the clouds were small, we'd go up and roll through the tops of them and fly around them and buzz down through them. And then, of course, we had instrument flight training, which was an integral part of our curriculum. They put hoods over the airplanes, and we were obliged to fly on instruments, simulate instruments. In addition to that, we had what was known as a link trainer. A link trainer was a gadget that sat on a pedestal tripod similar to these cockpit simulators that we have today. And in that link trainer, why we learned to fly on instruments and how to use the radio navigation as well as the panel instruments to negotiate the radios in ways that we could come in and land on certain runways. So to that extent, weather was a part of our training. And we knew about cumulus clouds, cumulonimbus clouds, we knew about lightning, we knew about fronts, of course, and how to use weather to go from cross country. So weather, of course, and pilot training go hand in hand.
And floods, did you know any flood, anything like we've had this summer in your lifetime?
Yes, there were floods. I recall back in the 30s there was a flood in Cincinnati that made headlines, but it didn't impress upon me as have some of the floods more recently. We knew about floods happen. They come from downbursts and they come from a lot of rain. The flood that we had this year was, of course, astonishing, down from Albany all the way to Americas. But floods are the kind of things that ecologists that I had learned about for years. And although it's devastating, it's just another natural weather phenomenon, which didn't surprise me, but of course shocked everybody who lived in the lowlands.
Let me take you back to the World War II era. Was there anything you were especially afraid of during those years?
Mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
More than anything, but teenagers aren't afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Venereal diseases. We were 18, 19 years old, and we were shown films about the impacts, the affects of venereal diseases. And furthermore, condoms were issued freely on our bases at that time. And they were issued primarily for the prevention of venereal diseases. Now, penicillin, we knew about penicillin. It was around, but penicillin wasn't abundant as a cure for venereal diseases. It wasn't until after the war that you could go get a shot of penicillin to help eradicate venereal disease. But I think venereal diseases and mosquitoes and getting lost were the primary fears that the guys in my outfit wrestled with more than anything else. We weren't afraid of flying upside down. We weren't afraid of going into battles. We weren't afraid of being downed in the Ocmulgee swamp anywhere. We knew we could get out or somebody'd come and get us. But when we saw those horrible images of what venereal disease could do to our bodies and our lives, that was enough to scare anybody.
You mentioned getting lost. Did anyone get lost around that Macon airfield or the other bases?
Oh, I got lost on the first cross-country flight I took. I was assigned, we had gone out on a dual cross-country orientation flight, my instructor and I, and he showed me the way and showed me how to do it. Then the next day, I was told to get in the aircraft and fly up to Jackson, Georgia. Well, I did. I flew from Macon to Jackson, Georgia, which is not very far, but for somehow or the other, I got 20 miles off course. So I did 180 degrees and tried to fly back to Macon. I couldn't find my place at Macon, and instead I flew on 20 miles south. Well, I had to turn around, and fortunately I did find out where I was, and when I got on the ground, then I was obliged to report to the captain to find out why I got off course. Lost. Well, that only happened once. The next time we had a dual cross-country, and I learned from those experiences. But there was always the fear of not being on course. And from that day onward, knowing where I was going, knowing how to get there, knowing what occurred along the way, have always been important to me, staying on course.
Did you have children eventually?
No, we had no children.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of academic children, but no personal children.
How did you and your wife meet after the war?
Oh, it was social occasion. I think we went to a New Year's party together, she with someone else, and I with her friend, and we occasionally dated our respective partners at that time, and 4 or 5 years later we got married. So nothing amorous.
Can you tell me a little bit about your work as the state climatologist? Did you bring some of the research to Athens? Can you tell me some of that?
That has been a very fascinating period in my life. As I said, the weather was a basis from my childhood on through flying school and after flying school too. But when I became state climatologist, I followed in the footsteps of a very important man whose name was Horace Carter, and he's still in Athens. He was a state climatologist here for 2 decades. He published a lot of statistical information about the climatic conditions at various parts of the state. And I knew that I couldn't exceed what he had done. All I could do is just change his numbers, and that wasn't very meaningful to me. So I wanted to find out why we had droughts in the South and why floods occurred. So it had always been a part of my life and career, professional career, to understand patterns of vegetation, how vegetation succeeded from old fields to mature woods patternistically. So patterns became an important goal in climate and weather for me. How do the patterns of climatic patterns in the South occur? Temperatures as well as precipitation, patterns. So I went back and got all the data that I could find and simply started studying patterns. Now once you understand the patterns, then you've got to find out why those patterns occur, why the peaks and the valleys, why patterns repeat, why it repeats itself. And the more I began to investigate the patterns, the more fascinating the factors causing those patterns became. Now those factors had been known for years, for many of them, the moon, for example, for millennia. But not many people really understood the patterns. And because the patterns in Georgia are differ from the patterns in South Carolina and the patterns in Alabama, there's a lot of controversy connected with what causes these weather patterns. Nevertheless, I attempted to find out why we have drought in the southeast, and to some extent I understand them better now than I did 15, 25 years ago.
Well, I'm very grateful. Were there heroes and villains 50 years ago?
Well, Franklin D. FDR was a hero in my family from the time I was 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old. The villains were Al Capone, Bruno Richard Hauptmann,
The Lindbergh kidnapper.
the Lindbergh kidnapper. I suppose there were others, but those two were impressionable, made an impression on me as a child.
Did you think anything of Harry Truman at the time?
After the war, we all wondered what Harry Truman would do. We knew that he had some inexperience in him. A lot of apprehension about Harry, but in retrospect now, Harry made a great president. Mr. Truman would take his early morning walks, and the press corps would follow on his heels, and he had no hesitation of telling people, the reporters, what he thought, when he thought it, and how he saw the situation. And although we had some apprehensions about Mr. Truman as a president at the outset, as I look back now, he's one of our greats.
And do you recall any of the popular culture from 50 years ago, any of the music or the movies or even books that may have been popular?
Well, movies were the pastime. Movies were 10 and 15 cents on Saturday matinees. I kept a little diary throughout my service career, and it wasn't regular, it was irregular, but in preparing for this, I went back, and by the way, I had it sealed for some 40 years, so I really didn't remember what was in it. And I opened it about 10 years ago, something like that. In preparing, just looking over this, I was astonished at the number of movies that I went to on Saturday and Sunday afternoon, and the names of the movies, and I recall them now, yes. They were fascinating. I remember one in particular called Orchestra Wives, which was a story about Glenn Miller and his band, and Jackie Gleason played in it, and Ann Rutherford played in it, and there were a few more. But the important facet of it, of Orchestra Wives, was Orchestra Wives contained some of the best music of the era. You talk about customs, how we went to drugstore soda counters and had cherry cokes for a nickel, that sort of thing. But Orchestra Wives was, as I recall, made about 1942, and it played throughout the war. I don't know how many times I saw it, but it was a wonderful cultural expression of life at that time. sort of Andy Hardy type movie.
Well, is there anything I haven't talked about? I tend to ask as a last question, and I'm in no hurry to stop or anything, but the last question I usually ask in these interviews is, of those experiences, is there something you would underline for people? If people were listening to you and knew the era of World War II only from history books or even videotapes, what do you think is most important from those experiences?
I hear so frequently today psychologists, counselors, and students talking about the need for self-esteem. And I think there's whole professions now built by people who want to teach students how to achieve self-esteem. To me, this is amazing because I never even thought about self-esteem. But yet, in reflection, in retrospect, back then, when I was in grade school, I made a birdhouse, and it worked. And I guess that gave me some self-esteem. I remember I made a gate out of lumber to hang on a post to keep the chickens out of the garden. And I suppose that was my kind of self-esteem. Being able to harness a horse or to hitch a horse was self-esteem. So what I think I'm saying is, I think the young people today need to do crafts, they need to do things that give them a certain amount of accomplishment rather than sit in front of the television a large portion of the time. I don't recall getting much self-esteem from the movies on Sunday afternoon or on Saturday afternoon. The self-esteem came from making things for yourself, doing things that had meaning. Even if it was picking blackberries. Terrible thing, we always got chiggers. But in the long run, it was a way of achieving a certain amount of self-esteem because you knew in the wintertime you could spread it on bread and it would taste good. So my message, I suppose, for young people today is, rather than talking about self-esteem and finding ways to achieve self-esteem, the best way to find it is work at something and make it work. And use those accomplishments as stepping stones, little they may be, to bigger things in life. And self-esteem, I think, comes from doing one thing at a time reasonably well.
I'm in full agreement with you. Is there anything from the era of World War II or that we haven't spoken of from the rest of your career that would be good to mention?
Well, it's a little difficult to pick out omissions, but I have always been fascinated with teaching, and I've had a lot of students over my career, some of whom have gone on to do wonderful things. But I think that one of the aspects of self-esteem, I suppose, that teachers have is knowing that the students that come to you eventually walk away and do something. And one of the aspects of state climatology that has been so satisfying to me is that the students that I had in the late 50s were students who called upon me to come tell them about climate and weather in the 80s. So those students have gone on to be successful managers of farm bureaus, farm organizations, businesses, and so on. And knowing that they have become successful is quite gratifying in the long run, and I think it is for any teacher. So those are the things that mean a lot to me as a teacher, an educator.
Means a lot to me to hear about. Did you reread that diary of yours recently? Were there sections that surprised you? Were there sections that described anything unique or personalities who were unique?
Yes. When I came to Macon and Cochrane Field in August of 1944, I was linked up with one of my grade school chums, and I had completely forgotten about my friend Joe Butler. We had a 50th reunion, about 7 or 8 years ago, something like that, and Joe Butler was there, and he reminded me that we were at Cochrane Field together, and that had escaped me completely. And as I went through the diary, there were a few things in there that I recall vividly now, but for 40 years or so, I had forgotten completely about them. There were new revelations, yes. But once they get refreshed, why, just part of the life back then.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, great. Now what are you going to do with all this?